I want you to imagine something with me right now. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, looking down into the darkness below. Your heart is pounding. Your palms are sweating. Someone beside you is shouting, "Jump! You must decide now." And every fiber of your being is screaming that something is terribly, terribly wrong. Not because of the cliff, not because of the height, but because you are being forced to choose before you are ready, before you truly know yourself, before you have looked into the depths of your own soul and asked the question that changes everything. What part of me is actually making this decision? You see, I have spent my entire life studying the human psyche, diving into the darkest corners of consciousness, exploring the territories where most people fear to go. And I can tell you with absolute certainty that the greatest tragedy I have witnessed is not that people make wrong decisions. No. The greatest tragedy is that most people make their most important decisions while completely unconscious of the forces controlling them from within. They think they are choosing freely, but they are puppets dancing on strings they cannot see. Strings pulled by parts of themselves they have never met, never acknowledged, never integrated. Right now, in this very moment, you are probably standing at some crossroads in your life. Maybe it is about a relationship that feels like it is suffocating you, or maybe it is about a career that once filled you with purpose but now feels like a prison. Maybe it is about where to live, who to become, whether to stay or leave, whether to speak or remain silent. And everyone around you has an opinion. Your mother has an opinion. Your father has an opinion. Your friends, your partner, your colleagues, they all have opinions. And beneath all that noise, there is a quiet voice inside you that you can barely hear anymore. A voice that is trying desperately to tell you something vital, something that could change everything. But here is what I discovered. What I learned through decades of working with people who were suffering precisely because they made decisions too quickly, too unconsciously. Before you decide anything of real importance, you must stop. You must become still. You must descend into yourself and meet the hidden forces that are actually running the show. Because if you do not, you will choose with only a fraction of yourself, and you will spend years, perhaps your entire life, living with the consequences of a decision that was never truly yours. This is why so many people feel trapped in lives they never consciously chose. They wake up at 40, 50, 60 years old and wonder, asterisk, how did I get here? Asterisk, the job they hate but cannot leave, the marriage that feels like a performance, the city that drains them, the identity that no longer fits. And they blame circumstances. They blame other people. They blame bad luck. But the truth is far more unsettling. They never made a real choice in the first place. They simply responded to pressure. They moved toward what felt safe, what looked impressive, what would quiet the voices of judgment around them. They chose from the surface of their being, from the ego, from the persona that mask we wear to survive in the social world. But beneath that mask, the self was screaming. It was screaming through anxiety, through inexplicable sadness, through that hollow feeling in your chest when you achieve something you thought you wanted, only to find it means nothing, through the recurring dreams that disturb your sleep, through the sudden panics, the strange symptoms, the compulsions you cannot explain. The unconscious does not argue with you. It does not send rational memos. It speaks in symptoms, in disruptions, in the collapse of what you thought was solid. I have seen this pattern countless times. A man builds his entire life around a career his father chose for him. He succeeds brilliantly. He is admired, wealthy, respected. And then, without warning, his body rebels. Illness, exhaustion, a breakdown that makes no medical sense. This is not weakness. This is not failure. This is the self, refusing to be ignored any longer. Or consider the woman who marries the right man, stable, kind, acceptable to her family. She cannot explain why she feels suffocated. She tries to be grateful. She lists his virtues like evidence in a trial. And yet, something in her withers. She becomes a ghost in her own life. What has happened? She chose with her head, with her conditioning, with her fear of being alone. But her soul was not consulted. And now, years later, the dreams come. Strange, recurring dreams, perhaps of a missed train, or a door she cannot open, or a letter that arrives too late. The unconscious speaks in symbols when we refuse to listen in daylight. These are not random images. They are messages from the self that was abandoned. I see this pattern repeat across generations. The young man who becomes a lawyer because his father was a lawyer, though his hands ache to build things, to work with wood, to create something tangible. He wins his cases, earns his promotions, but there is a hollowness in his chest that no achievement can fill. At 40, he buys expensive tools he never uses. At 50, he develops inexplicable back pain. The body keeps score when the soul is denied. Or consider the woman who discovers, at 35, that she feels nothing when her child speaks to her. She performs motherhood beautifully. She attends every school event, prepares nutritious meals, maintains the appearance of devotion. But inside, there is only numbness. She chose motherhood because it was expected, because her own mother pressured her, because society told her this would complete her. But her soul never wanted children, and now both she and the child suffer from this unconscious resentment, this unspoken truth that poisons the air between them. The tragedy is not that we make wrong choices. The tragedy is that we make unconscious choices and then wonder why our lives feel like prisons. We blame circumstance, bad luck, other people. We say, this is just how life is. This is what being an adult means. But deep down, we know. We have always known. There is a moment in every person's life, sometimes many moments, when the soul speaks clearly. It might be a sudden surge of joy when considering a certain path. It might be a feeling of rightness, of recognition, as though you have finally found the language for something you have always known. Or it might come as profound unease, a visceral rejection, your entire being saying no though your mind insists you should say yes. These moments are sacred. They are the self trying to guide you toward your own becoming. But we have been trained to distrust them, to dismiss them as impractical, childish, unrealistic. We live in a world that teaches us that value is measured in productivity, that worth is calculated in output, that time must always be justified by tangible results. And so when we feel pulled towards something that cannot be monetized, cannot be explained, cannot be defended in a performance review, we silence it. I have watched brilliant people drain themselves in careers they found meaningless, all because they could not trust the quiet voice that whispered, asterisk, this is not your path, asterisk. They had worked so hard to get there. They had invested so much. To turn away felt like failure. And so they stayed, year after year, feeling themselves grow hollow, wondering why success tasted like ash. The self does not care about your resume. It does not care about impressing others or maintaining appearances. It cares only about your wholeness, your authenticity, your alignment with who you actually are beneath all the roles you have learned to perform. When you ignore these pulls, these intuitions, these moments of deep recognition, you are not being practical. You are being cowardly. You are choosing the familiar discomfort of self-betrayal over the unfamiliar terror of becoming real. And here is what happens when you continue to ignore the self's guidance. The symptoms intensify. What begins as restlessness becomes anxiety. What starts as vague dissatisfaction becomes depression. What whispers becomes a scream. The psyche will not be silenced forever. It will find ways to get your attention through your body, through your dreams, through the patterns that keep repeating until you finally learn the lesson they are trying to teach. I call this compensation. When conscious life becomes too one-sided, too disconnected from the deeper currents of the psyche, the unconscious compensates. It sends up signals, symptoms, disruptions, anything to restore balance, to pull you back toward wholeness. The anxiety you cannot explain, the exhaustion that no amount of rest can cure. The nagging sense that something is profoundly wrong, even when everything looks fine on paper. These are not disorders to be medicated away. They are messages. They are the self, knocking harder because you would not answer when it knocked softly. And what does the self say when at last you open the door? It says, "You have been living someone else's life." Not dramatically, not with malice. You simply absorbed expectations like a sponge absorbs water. Your parents' unfulfilled dreams became your career path. Your culture's definition of success became your personal prison. The persona you built to survive childhood became the wall separating you from everything you truly are. I have watched this pattern repeat across thousands of cases. The successful lawyer who cannot explain why he weeps at night. The devoted mother who feels nothing when she looks at her children. The acclaimed artist who secretly despises every piece he creates. They followed the script perfectly and lost themselves in the performance. The shadow does not emerge to destroy you. It emerges because you have already been destroying yourself, slowly, by inches, through years of self-abandonment. Your rage is not the problem. Your rage is information about boundaries you have let others cross. Your sadness is not weakness. Your sadness is the accumulated grief of every time you betrayed yourself to keep the peace. Your anxiety is not a malfunction. Your anxiety is your psyche screaming that the life you are living and the person you actually are have diverged so far that the gap may soon become unbridgeable. The modern world tells you to fix these feelings with pills, with positive thinking, with productivity hacks. But you cannot fix what is not broken. You can only listen to what it is trying to tell you. I knew a woman once, a patient who came to me at 45, completely numb. "I feel nothing," she said. "I should be grateful. I have everything. But I feel like I'm watching my life through glass." We worked for months, and slowly, beneath the numbness, we found rage, volcanic, ancient rage. At her father, yes, but more than that at herself. For every year she had smiled when she wanted to scream. For every dream she had quietly buried. For every part of herself she had amputated to fit into a life that was never truly hers. When that rage finally surfaced, she was terrified. "This isn't me," she insisted. But it was her, the most authentic part of her she had ever allowed herself to meet. She spent the next 3 months deliberately engaging with the parts of herself she had buried, not in some abstract, spiritual sense, but practically. She went to places that frightened her socially. She spoke opinions she had trained herself to swallow. She allowed herself to want things she had been taught were selfish. And what she discovered was this: the shadow doesn't dissolve when you face it. It transforms. It becomes fuel. The anger she had repressed for years, it became discernment. The ability to say no, to protect herself. The sexuality she had deemed inappropriate. It became vitality, creativity, a reconnection to her own aliveness. The ambition she had called arrogance, it became direction, purpose. The courage to build something meaningful, This is what I tried to tell the world throughout my entire career. The shadow is not your enemy. It is your unlived life. And until you live it, you will remain half a person, forever projecting your disowned potential onto others, forever running from the very thing that could make you whole. Now, let me address something critical here, because this is where most people stumble. They confuse integration with indulgence. Integration is not giving yourself permission to act on every impulse. It's not saying, well, I have a shadow, so I might as well cheat on my partner, steal from my employer, or lash out at everyone who annoys me. That's not integration. That's possession. That's allowing the shadow to take control, because you've swung from repression to inflation. True integration is conscious relationship. It's acknowledging that, yes, I have the capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for destruction, and because I acknowledge it, I can choose how to channel it. I can transform that aggressive energy into assertiveness, that selfishness into healthy boundaries, that destructive impulse into the ability to dismantle what no longer serves me. The shadow integrated becomes power. The shadow denied becomes poison. Think of it this way. A river that's dammed up will eventually overflow or erode its banks. But a river that's acknowledged, channeled, directed, that river powers entire cities. The energy doesn't disappear. It gets used consciously. When you begin redirecting this energy consciously, something extraordinary happens. You stop being a victim of your impulses and become an architect of your character. I've seen this transformation countless times in my practice. A man who once dissipated his vitality in endless conquests discovers a sudden capacity for creative work. A woman who redirected her emotional energies develops insights that reshape entire fields of thought. The energy doesn't vanish, it crystallizes into something permanent. This is what the alchemists called transformation of lead into gold. They weren't talking about literal metals. They were describing the metamorphosis of base instinct into refined consciousness. The raw material was always valuable, it just needed to be worked upon with intention. Your body already knows how to do this. When you exercise intensely, sexual energy transforms into physical strength. When you engage in deep creative work, it becomes inspiration. When you meditate or contemplate, it becomes spiritual insight. These aren't different energies, they're the same energy wearing different clothes. The ancients understood this intuitively. Why do you think monks and yogis practiced celibacy? Not because sexuality was evil, but because they recognized it as the most concentrated form of life force available to human beings. They were spiritual scientists, conducting experiments with their own consciousness. But here's what most people miss. Sublimation isn't about denial. It's about elevation. If you simply suppress the energy, you create a pressure cooker. The lid will eventually blow off, often in destructive ways. Neurosis, addiction, violence. These are what happen when life force has nowhere to go. True sublimation is different. It's like opening channels throughout your entire being, allowing the energy to rise naturally through different levels of expression. The Chinese called these channels meridians. The Indians called them nadis. The names change, but the map remains consistent across cultures. When energy rises to your solar plexus, it becomes willpower and ambition. When it reaches your heart, it becomes compassion and connection. When it arrives at your throat, it becomes authentic expression. When it finally reaches your crown, it becomes pure awareness. This isn't mysticism, it's psychology, dressed in symbolic language. And every person who's ever achieved something extraordinary has learned to channel their vital energy upward rather than outward. Now, here's something I rarely discussed in public settings, but something I observed time and again in my consulting room. The people who came to me weren't suffering from chemical imbalances, they were suffering from energy leaks. They had holes in their psychic container. They were pouring their life force into relationships that depleted them, jobs that deadened them, and addictions that promised satisfaction but delivered only emptiness. One woman comes to mind, successful by every external measure. Beautiful home, respected career, loving family. Yet she came to me hollow-eyed, describing herself as a ghost moving through her own life. When we explored her patterns, we discovered she'd spent 30 years performing the role of the good daughter, the perfect wife, the accomplished professional. Every interaction was a transaction where she gave away pieces of herself. I asked her a simple question. When was the last time you felt truly alive? She couldn't remember. Endwo. Be no. Endwo. Be no. One state. That's what happens when you scatter your energy to meet everyone else's expectations. You become a stranger to your own vitality. The path to mastery, and I don't just mean professional mastery. I mean mastery of yourself, requires you to become ruthlessly protective of your energy. You must learn to say no, not occasionally, but habitually. No to the people who drain you. No to the activities that leave you depleted. No to the thoughts that spiral you into anxiety or depression. This sounds selfish to modern ears, doesn't it? We've been trained to believe that virtue means self-sacrifice, that goodness requires exhausting yourself for others. But I'll tell you what I told that woman. A lamp that's run out of oil can't light anyone's way. You're not serving the world by burning yourself out. You're just creating another person who needs to be carried. The greatest individuals I studied, the artists, the scientists, the spiritual teachers, they all understood this principle instinctively. They protected their solitude like dragons guarding treasure. They knew that their creative power depended on having enough psychic energy to descend into the unconscious and return with something valuable. But here's what most people fail to grasp. Protecting your solitude doesn't mean becoming a hermit. It doesn't mean withdrawing from life entirely. That would be another form of imbalance, another evasion of wholeness. No. What I'm describing is something far more nuanced. It's about conscious boundaries. It's about understanding that you have a finite amount of life force, and that every interaction, every commitment, every yes you give away is an expenditure of that force. Think of yourself as a reservoir. Every day, you wake with a certain depth of water. Some of it replenishes naturally through sleep, through quiet moments, through activities that restore rather than drain you. But throughout the day, people come to your reservoir with their buckets. They want advice. They want entertainment. They want you to solve their problems, validate their feelings, distract them from their emptiness. And if you're not careful, if you haven't learned to say no, you'll find yourself completely drained by noon. You'll have given away all your water. And when you finally sit down to do your own work, to pursue your own calling, there's nothing left. The well is dry. I've watched countless talented individuals squander their potential this way. They had genuine gifts, real capacity for creation and contribution, but they never learned to protect their inner resources. They said yes to every invitation, every request, every demand on their attention. They mistook this generosity for virtue, never realizing they were actually avoiding the harder task, the confrontation with their own depths. Because, make no mistake, facing yourself requires energy, tremendous energy. The journey into the unconscious is not a passive drift. It's an active descent. Like a deep-sea diver pushing down into dark waters where the pressure increases with every meter. Most people simply don't have the energy for this journey because they've spent it all on the surface of life. They've exhausted themselves in the shallows, splashing around in other people's dramas, And now they wonder why they feel so hollow, so disconnected from any sense of purpose or meaning. And this exhaustion, this spiritual fatigue, it's precisely what modern society encourages. You're rewarded for being busy, for being accessible, for spreading yourself thin across a dozen different commitments. The culture celebrates the person who's always available, always responding, always engaged with the external world. But what it doesn't tell you is that this constant, outward focus creates a kind of spiritual anemia. You become depleted at the level of soul. I've watched people come into my consulting room carrying this depletion, like a heavy coat they can't remove. They describe a numbness, a sense that life is happening to them rather than through them. And when I ask them about solitude, about time alone with their own thoughts, they look at me as though I've suggested something dangerous. But won't I become depressed? But, they ask, won't the loneliness consume me? What they don't understand is that loneliness and solitude are entirely different experiences. Loneliness is the pain of disconnection, a feeling that can occur even in a crowded room. Solitude, on the other hand, is chosen aloneness, a deliberate stepping away from the noise so that you can hear what's been drowned out. Solitude is where you meet yourself, perhaps for the first time in years, and discover whether you're someone worth knowing. The resistance to this meeting is tremendous, because when you're alone with yourself, really alone, you can't maintain the performance anymore. The masks fall away. The stories you've been telling about who you are and what your life means, they start to crack and reveal the emptiness underneath. And this is terrifying. This is why people reach for their phones the moment they're alone in an elevator. Why they need background noise constantly. Why silence has become something to be filled rather than honored. But here's what I discovered in my own confrontation with the unconscious. The void isn't actually empty. What we experience as nothingness is really the overwhelming presence of everything we've refused to acknowledge. It's the accumulated weight of every authentic impulse we've suppressed, every truth we've avoided, every part of ourselves we've exiled into darkness because it didn't fit the story we needed to tell. When you sit in genuine solitude, not just physical aloneness, but psychological solitude where you've stripped away all the narratives and distractions, you begin to hear voices. Not the voices of madness, but the voices of all the sub-personalities you've been carrying within you. The angry child, who never got to express their rage. The creative spirit you buried to pursue practical success. The tender, vulnerable self you armored over to survive in a harsh world. This is the polyphonic nature of the psyche that I spent decades trying to map. We're not singular, unified beings. We're more like a parliament, a congress of competing interests and desires, all claiming to represent who we truly are. And the ego, that executive function we identify as I, is really just the loudest voice in the room, not necessarily the wisest one. The modern crisis isn't that we're lost in the void, it's that we've become so terrified of discovering this multiplicity within ourselves that we've handed over the chairmanship of our inner parliament to whatever external voice shouts. Loudest, the algorithm, the influencer, the ideology, the brand. We've outsourced the difficult work of self-governance. I remember patients who would come to me utterly convinced they knew themselves, only to discover in the analytic process that the person they thought they were was really just a character they'd been performing. A successful businessman who realized he'd been living out his father's unlived life. A devoted mother who discovered beneath her selfless persona a deep well of resentment and unexpressed ambition. These discoveries are never comfortable. The persona resists because it has been our protection, our social face, the mask that allowed us to navigate the world. To examine it too closely feels like threatening our very existence. But this discomfort, this resistance, is precisely what tells us we're approaching something real. The shadow work becomes even more complex when we realize that it's not just about personal wounds or individual failures. We carry collective shadows as well. Every culture, Every society, every historical moment, has aspects of human experience it refuses to acknowledge. And those collective denials become part of our individual psychology. Think of how certain emotions become culturally forbidden. In some societies, anger is the shadow emotion, pushed down and denied until it erupts in unexpected ways. In others, sadness or vulnerability becomes the forbidden territory. Men in particular often carry the shadow of softness, of need, of fear, all the feelings their culture told them were incompatible with masculinity. And women carry the shadow of ambition, of anger, of sexual desire, everything their society deemed unfeminine. I've watched how these collective shadows operate across generations. A patient comes to me depressed, anxious, unable to understand why they feel such profound unease. And as we work together, we discover they're carrying not just their own unlived life, but the unlived lives of their parents, sometimes even their grandparents, the grandfather who survived war by numbing himself to feeling, the grandmother who sacrificed her dreams to duty. These unlived experiences don't simply disappear, they become psychological inheritance, shadows passed down through families like heirlooms of pain. This is what I meant when I spoke of the collective unconscious. We're not just individuals bumping around in isolation. We're connected through deeper patterns, archetypal structures that transcend personal experience. The shadow is personal, yes, but it's also transpersonal. It connects us to larger human themes, to universal struggles between light and dark, consciousness and unconsciousness, acknowledgement and denial. And here's what people often miss. The collective shadow isn't just about big historical atrocities. It's active right now, in the room with you, in every conversation you're avoiding, in every social media comment section where rage boils over, in every political debate where we've stopped seeing human beings and started seeing monsters. You see it when entire groups project their darkness onto other groups, when one political side calls the other evil without examining what they themselves are capable of, when nations dehumanize other nations to justify violence, when communities create scapegoats to avoid looking at their own dysfunction. This is shadow projection on a massive scale, and it happens because we refuse to do the individual work. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. You cannot have collective healing without individual responsibility. The mob doesn't have a shadow problem. You do. The system isn't just broken out there somewhere. It's broken in here, in the ways you lie to yourself, in the judgments you make automatically, in the feelings you suppress because they don't fit your self-image. And this is where integration becomes not just personal work, but moral work. When you refuse to acknowledge your shadow, when you keep pretending you're only capable of goodness, you make yourself available for possession by the very darkness you deny. You become a vessel for unconscious evil, convinced the whole time that you're righteous. History is filled with people who committed atrocities while believing themselves to be good. They weren't lying, they genuinely couldn't see their shadow. They projected it so completely onto others that torture became justice, genocide became purification, and cruelty became duty. This is what happens when the shadow is rejected rather than integrated. It doesn't disappear. It gains power. It finds expression through righteousness, through moral certainty, through the absolute conviction that we are good and they are bad. So when I talk about shadow work, I'm not just talking about feeling better or having healthier relationships, though those things matter. I'm talking about the moral obligation each of us has to become conscious, to stop feeding the collective darkness with our personal denial. The crisis we face today is not primarily technological or political, it is psychological. We have harnessed tremendous power without achieving corresponding wisdom. We have split the atom before we have integrated the psyche. And this, more than any external threat, is what imperils us. You see this pattern repeating throughout history. Every great civilization that has collapsed did so not because of external invasion alone, but because of internal fragmentation. Rome fell not just to the barbarians, but to its own moral decay. Its inability to reconcile the values it proclaimed with the reality it lived. The projection of all evil onto the outsider, the barbarian, the heretic, the other blinded them to the corruption festering within their own walls. We are walking the same path. When a society refuses to acknowledge its shadow, when it insists on seeing itself as purely good and progressive while demonizing anyone who disagrees, it is already in decline. The energy that should go toward genuine transformation gets diverted into performative righteousness, into public displays of virtue that cost nothing and change nothing. I watch people today compete to demonstrate their moral purity, to prove they are on the right side of history. But history has no sides, only consequences. And the consequence of this collective shadow denial is a society that grows more polarized, more fragmented, more unable to have honest conversations about difficult truths. The shadow work I am calling for is not self-indulgent, navel-gazing. It is the most practical, urgent work we can do. Because every time you integrate one piece of your personal shadow, you remove one brick from the edifice of collective evil. Every time you own your capacity for cruelty, for prejudice, for self-deception, you make it slightly less likely that you will participate in the next great moral catastrophe that people rationalize in the name of good. This is why I have always insisted that psychology is not merely a theoretical discipline, it is an ethical one. It concerns not just our well-being, but our moral responsibility. The question is not simply, how can I be happy? But how can I become whole enough that I do not add to the sum of human suffering? No. And here we arrive at perhaps the most difficult truth. The work of confronting the shadow is never finished. It is not a problem you solve once and then move on. It is a lifelong practice, a perpetual turning toward what you would rather turn away from. Just when you think you have integrated your aggression, you discover a new form of it, passive violence. The violence of withdrawal, of withholding love. Just when you believe you have overcome your prejudices, you notice the subtle ways you still categorize and judge. The shadow has infinite layers, infinite disguises. It is as creative as the ego itself. Because it is made of the same material, it is simply the rejected half of your wholeness. This can sound exhausting, and I will not pretend otherwise. But there is something profoundly liberating in accepting that you will never be finished. It removes the burden of perfection. You no longer have to maintain the exhausting fiction that you are one of the good people, one of the enlightened ones who has transcended human darkness. You can simply be a person flawed, contradictory, perpetually in process. And, paradoxically, this acceptance makes you less dangerous, not more. The people who cause the greatest harm are not those who acknowledge their capacity for evil, but those who are convinced they have none. The inquisitor believes he serves God. The fanatic believes she serves justice. The tyrant believes he serves the people. It is always those who are most certain of their righteousness who are most capable of atrocity. But when you truly know that you carry within you the same impulses you condemn in others, you become humble. You become cautious. You question your certainties. You hesitate before casting the first stone, because you recognize the thrower's hand as your own. And in that hesitation, something extraordinary happens. The rigid architecture of your worldview begins to soften. Those ironclad convictions you clutched so desperately, they loosen their grip just enough for doubt to enter. And contrary to what your ego fears, this doubt does not weaken you. It deepens you. I have watched this transformation countless times in my practice. A patient would arrive absolutely convinced of their rightness about their marriage, their career, their parents, their enemies. They carried these certainties like armor, never realizing the armor had become their prison. Then the dreams would begin revealing what they refused to see. The tyrannical father appeared as themselves, shouting at their own children. The unfaithful spouse appeared as their own wandering desires, projected outward. The incompetent colleague appeared as their own inadequacy, safely displaced onto another. And when these recognitions finally broke through, not as intellectual concepts, but as lived emotional truth, the armor cracked, the certainty crumbled. And beneath it? Not weakness, not chaos, but something far more durable. Wisdom tempered by humility. This is the paradox that eludes most people. They believe strength lies in unwavering conviction, in never admitting doubt, in maintaining their position against all evidence. But this is not strength. This is brittleness, masquerading as fortitude. True strength lies in the flexibility to revise yourself, to admit error, to hold your beliefs lightly enough that reality can still reach you. The shadow teaches you this flexibility by force. Once you have met the monster within, you can never again claim absolute moral high ground with the same confidence. You have seen where righteousness leads when left unchecked. You have felt the intoxication of judgment, the pleasure of condemnation. You have tasted what makes tyrants possible, and now you know. You know that the distance between yourself and those you despise is not as vast as you imagined. You know that under sufficient pressure, in different circumstances, with different wounds and different triggers, you too might have chosen the path you now condemn. This knowledge does not excuse evil. It does not erase responsibility or dissolve moral distinctions. But it does something perhaps more important. It makes you human among humans, rather than judge among the accused. And in this shared humanity lies the possibility of genuine transformation, not through condemnation, but through consciousness. Consider what happens when you stop projecting your shadow and begin to own it. The energy you once spent maintaining your righteous position, defending your moral superiority, becomes available for something far more valuable: understanding. You begin to see others not as embodiments of everything you've rejected in yourself, but as fellow travelers struggling with the same darkness you carry. This shift is not subtle. It changes the very quality of your presence in the world. Where you once saw evil, you begin to see pain. Where you saw depravity, you recognize desperation. Where you saw monsters, you discover wounded human beings acting out unintegrated aspects of themselves. This doesn't mean you approve of their actions or abandon discernment. It means you stop adding your own unconscious shadow to the already considerable suffering in the world. The paradox is striking. The more you accept your own capacity for darkness, the less dark your actual behavior becomes. By acknowledging the shadow, you drain it of its compulsive power. What you own consciously cannot possess you unconsciously. I watched this process countless times in my practice. A patient would arrive convinced of their fundamental goodness, utterly blind to their cruelty, their selfishness, their capacity for harm. They came seeking validation, but what they needed was integration. The therapeutic work required them to descend into their own depths, to encounter the aspects of themselves they'd spent lifetimes avoiding. The descent was never pleasant. It required brutal honesty, a willingness to see oneself without the comforting filters of self-justification. But those who made this journey emerged fundamentally changed. They became more human, more humble, more capable of genuine compassion. Their morality shifted from performance to authenticity, from rigid rules to conscious choice. This is the work the world desperately needs now. Not more people proclaiming their virtue while acting out their shadow on social media. Not more righteous crusaders projecting their disowned darkness onto convenient targets. But individuals willing to do the difficult work of self-examination, of shadow integration, of becoming conscious. Because here is the truth that changes everything. You cannot heal what you refuse to see. You cannot integrate what you continue to project. You cannot become whole while maintaining the fiction of your spotless goodness. The mechanism is simple, but its implications are profound. Every quality you vehemently deny in yourself doesn't disappear, it goes underground. It becomes autonomous. It gains power precisely through your refusal to acknowledge it. I've watched this pattern repeat across thousands of sessions. The woman who proclaims herself incapable of cruelty will find herself engaging in the most sophisticated forms of psychological manipulation, all while genuinely believing she's being helpful. The man who insists he has no capacity for cowardice will construct an entire life of careful avoidance, convinced he's simply being prudent. The shadow doesn't announce itself with obvious symptoms. It operates through rationalization, through blind spots, through those moments where you suddenly find yourself acting in ways that contradict your most cherished self-image. Then immediately constructing elaborate justifications for why this situation was different, why normal rules don't apply. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. The larger your persona of goodness, the more monstrous your shadow becomes. The person who needs to be seen as endlessly patient accumulates a reservoir of rage. The one who projects constant strength harbors an ocean of unacknowledged vulnerability. The perpetually cheerful individual carries depths of unprocessed grief, and society reinforces this split at every turn. We're taught to curate ourselves, to present only the acceptable parts. Social media has turned this into an art form. The carefully filtered life where every moment confirms the story we want others to believe. But the parts you edit out don't cease to exist. They gather force in the darkness. I've seen what happens when people spend decades maintaining this division. The shadow doesn't stay contained. It leaks out in passive aggression, in projection onto others, in sudden explosions that seem to come from nowhere. It emerges in your relationships, where you find yourself inexplicably triggered by qualities in others that mirror your own denied aspects. It manifests in your choices, subtly sabotaging the very goals you consciously claim to pursue. The pressure builds. The denied self demands recognition, even if it must seize that recognition through destructive means. And so, the shadow finds its expression, not through conscious will, but through the cracks in your carefully maintained facade. You explode at a minor inconvenience. You find yourself inexplicably drawn to chaos when your life finally achieves stability. You watch yourself make decisions that contradict everything you believe about who you are. This is the shadow's rebellion. This is what happens when integration is refused. Consider the person who prides themselves on rationality, on logic, on being above emotion. They've built an entire identity on intellectual superiority, dismissing feeling as weakness, as something lesser minds indulge. But the emotional life doesn't disappear simply because you deny it. It accumulates in the unconscious, growing in intensity, waiting. Then, one day, something minor happens. A criticism at work, a perceived slight, and suddenly this bastion of rationality is consumed by irrational rage, by emotional devastation completely disproportionate to the trigger. They cannot understand their own response. They're horrified by it. They swear it will never happen again. But it will, because nothing has been integrated. The shadow merely retreats, gathers strength, waits for the next opening. Or consider the person who has defined themselves entirely by their kindness, their willingness to help, their self-sacrifice. They've built a life on being needed, on being the person others can always count on. But beneath this saintly exterior, resentment grows. Anger at never being reciprocated. Rage at being taken for granted. They cannot acknowledge these feelings consciously. To do so would shatter their self-image, would contradict the very foundation of their identity. So the resentment expresses itself sideways, through passive aggression, through subtle sabotage of the very people they claim to love, through illnesses that conveniently prevent them from giving more. The shadow always finds a way. And here is what you must understand. These eruptions, these moments when the denied self seizes control, are not failures of character. They are desperate communications from the unconscious. They are the psyche's way of saying, you cannot continue like this. You cannot remain this divided. Integration is not optional. It is necessary for wholeness. The question is whether you will hear this message or continue to treat these eruptions as isolated incidents, as aberrations to be suppressed rather than signals to be heeded. And so we arrive at the threshold of conscious choice. You stand before the mirror of your own psyche, perhaps for the first time truly seeing what has always been there. The question now becomes practical, immediate. How does one actually integrate the shadow? Let me be clear from the outset. There is no formula, no step-by-step program that will deliver you from darkness into light. The psyche does not operate like a machine that can be repaired with the right tools. Integration is an art, not a science. And like all art, it requires patience, courage, and a willingness to work with materials that are messy, unpredictable, and sometimes frightening. But there are principles, ways of approaching this work that have proven effective over decades of clinical practice and personal exploration. The first and most essential is this. You must learn to observe without judgment. This sounds simple, but it is perhaps the most difficult task the human mind can undertake. We are conditioned from earliest childhood to judge, to categorize experiences as good or bad, acceptable or unacceptable. When an unwanted thought arises, a flash of envy, a moment of cruelty, a sexual fantasy that contradicts your moral self-image, the immediate response is rejection. I am not like that. That is not me. But shadow work begins with the radical act of simply noticing. When jealousy rises in your chest as a colleague receives praise, instead of immediately suppressing it or rationalizing it away, you pause. You observe it as you might observe a bird landing on a branch outside your window. Ah, there is jealousy. How interesting. This is not indulgence. You are not acting on the feeling, not feeding it with fantasy or justification. You are simply acknowledging its existence without the usual cascade of shame and denial that forces it back into darkness. And here, something shifts. Because you have stopped running from it. You have stopped treating it like a disease that must be eradicated immediately. You have given it a moment of your conscious attention. This alone begins the transformation. The feeling does not grow larger. When you observe it, it grows clearer. You see its contours, its origins, its particular texture. You begin to understand that this is not some monstrous invader, but a part of your own psyche trying desperately to communicate something. Perhaps that anger is pointing toward a boundary you have not defended. Perhaps that desire is revealing a need you have long suppressed. Perhaps that fear is protecting something precious that you have not yet fully acknowledged. This is the intelligence of the unconscious. It does not speak in logical arguments. It speaks in images, in sensations, in eruptions that force their way into your orderly life. And when you meet these eruptions with curiosity, rather than violence, you create the possibility of integration. Let me be clear. Integration does not mean acting on every impulse. It does not mean justifying every shadow tendency. It means bringing these aspects into relationship with consciousness, where they can be understood, where their energy can be transformed. The man who integrates his aggressive impulses does not become more violent, he becomes more capable of healthy assertion. The woman who integrates her sexual shadow does not become promiscuous, she becomes more whole in her relationship to desire. This is the paradox that eludes so many. They believe that acknowledging the darkness will unleash it. But it is the unacknowledged darkness that possesses us, that acts through us in ways we cannot control. When you bring light to the shadow, it loses its compulsive power. Not immediately, not magically, but gradually, through the patient work of conscious relationship. I have watched this process in countless individuals. The transformation is never what they expect. They think they will become someone else entirely. Instead, they become more fully themselves. They discover capacities they had disowned. They reclaim energy that had been locked in the effort of repression. They stop living in constant fear of their own depths. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the inner war begins to quiet. This quieting is not the silence of suppression, but the silence of integration. It is what happens when opposing forces within you are no longer at war, but in conversation. When your conscious intentions and unconscious impulses learn to work together rather than against each other. I have seen this transformation occur in the most unexpected ways. A man who spent years denying his sensitivity, his capacity for tenderness, suddenly finds himself able to be present with his dying father. The walls he built to protect himself from vulnerability become, in that moment, less important than connection. And in allowing himself to feel, he discovers not weakness, but a profound strength he never knew he possessed. A woman who has always been the strong one, the caretaker, the rock for everyone else, finally allows herself to break down. She cries for the first time in years, and rather than falling apart as she feared, she finds herself strangely whole. The tears were not a sign of collapse, but of thaw. The frozen places within her begin to move again. This is the paradox of shadow integration. What you feared would destroy you actually completes you. The parts of yourself you rejected as unacceptable turn out to be essential pieces of your wholeness. Not because those parts are good in themselves, necessarily, but because their energy, once conscious and directed, serves your larger purpose. The shadow, you see, contains not only your darkness, but also your unlived potential. It holds the qualities you were told were inappropriate, the dreams you were shamed for having, the aspects of yourself that didn't fit the narrow definition of acceptability you inherited from your family, your culture, your time. When you reclaim these parts, you reclaim your vitality. You stop living as a fragment and begin living as a whole person. The energy you spent maintaining the division between acceptable and unacceptable self becomes available for creativity, for love, for engagement with life itself. And here is what I want you to understand with absolute clarity. This process never truly ends. There is no final arrival, no permanent state of complete integration. The work of becoming conscious is the work of a lifetime. New shadows emerge as you grow. New layers reveal themselves. Each stage of life brings its own darkness to be faced, its own depths to be explored. But this is not discouraging news. This is the beauty of the human journey. You are not trying to reach some fixed destination where all inner conflict ceases.